Hi, I'm Arthur Gleckler. I'm here to introduce Mark Stevenson, who's going to tell us why, despite everything we've heard, the future is going to be bright. Here's Mark.
Hello. Hello, can you all hear me? Okay. Even those sort of people at the back who are skulking like teenagers. Can you hear? Okay? Okay, that's good. So psychologists at the University of Strathclyde have concluded that people may perform better at public speaking if they've recently had sex. So I'm going to apologize now. I love that way you got that one just a little bit later than everybody else. Fantastic. I want to start by showing you two photographs. So this is a typical ranchland farm in New Mexico. In fact, it's typical of ranchland farms around the world. And this is the farm next door. And these two pictures were taken on the same day. But the second farm is increasing its biodiversity, it's increasing its yields, it's reducing its costs, and it's sequestering thousands of tons of CO2 into the soil. Now, I want to return to these farms a little later because what they're doing isn't important in and of itself, but also it says a lot about how we should approach the future. So the first thing I want to say is that my book, An Optimist Tour of the Future, did not start off with a reference to optimism in the title. When I pitched it originally, it was simply called A World Tour of the Future. And it was a book I wanted to write in order to make sense for myself of our rapidly evolving and innovating world. What is the biotech revolution? What is all that nanotechnology stuff about? Can Andrew Lloyd Webber be stopped? And so on, you know. And I wanted to write a book that could be read by anyone. So a lot of books about the topics I write about are written for people who read Scientific American or New Scientist. And sure, I wanted to write a book for them too, but I wanted to write a book for a more general audience. And that's because I'm really passionate about making this stuff accessible, because the ethical, the social policy, and the economic issues that come out of things like genomics, synthetic biology, networks, climate change, nanotechnology, these things are going to change the way we live, and it's truly important that more people are informed. So that was my aim, but by the time I'd come back from my travels, the word optimist had got into the title. And that's because I'd seen so many possibilities for a brighter future. And I'll be honest, that surprised me. So in the course of my research, I spoke to a man called Stuart Brand. You may know him as the author of Whole Earth Discipline. And in referring to the tools that technology now offers us, he wrote, "We are as gods, and we have to get good at it." Well, I don't think we'll do that if not enough of us are informed. We could become bad gods. And all that talk of us becoming gods all that talk of us becoming gods is a little daunting to some people. And others find that language inflammatory. So I prefer instead to say that we're moving from being the tenants of the planet to becoming the landlord. So until recently, we acted a bit like students, you know. We tended not to care too much if one of us threw up on the carpet or dented the wall, because it wasn't our carpet after all. Except when it comes to the planet, of course, it is. So we need a bit of a rethink. And yes, British Petroleum, I am talking to you. And if you don't like that analogy, here's another take I came across when I visited the Mojave spaceport, where the commercial spaceflight industry is literally getting off the ground. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the people at Mojave. They are mostly fiercely right-wing libertarians. They're military-minded. They hunt, they shoot, they fish. They hate liberals. Now, this is Dick Rutan. He's arguably one of the world's finest aviators. And he told me, and this is a direct quote, "Stephen Hawking is a prick. You're telling me I can't go faster than the speed of light? Bullshit. Einstein's theory of relativity? Bullshit. Never look at a limitation as anything you ever comply with. Never. Only look at it as an opportunity for greatness." Now, Dick also told me that what fighter pilots use for birth control are their personalities, and I believe him. So it'd be very easy to characterize these hard-living, swearing, frontier-loving characters as unthinking searchers of novelty who appropriate resources for their own ambitions with little care for the ecological impact. But that would be wrong, because all of them were strong advocates of sustainability. This is Stuart Witt, the spaceport manager, and he said to me, How would you explain our unsustainable use of fossil fuels to an alien? It's rather barbaric. So doing this thing we dub green is literally doing the right thing. This isn't about politics. It's about doing the right thing as stewards of spaceship Earth. And he's echoing the sentiment of William S. Burroughs, who said, after one look at this planet, any visitor from outer space would say, I want to see the manager. This is the guy on the left here is Jeff Greason. He's standing next to Rick Searfoss, who's an ex-shuttle pilot. And Greason runs a startup at Mojave called X-Corps. They build space planes. And he said to me, I can't support the industrial scale reckless waste of the planet. I like the planet. It's where all my stuff is. And I think we should manage it better, because like it or not, we're in charge of it. And I agree with him. I like this planet. It's where all my stuff is. And I guess you feel the same too. And not only do I think we should manage it better, I think we can. So science is putting at our disposal tools that are growing in power every day and at an astonishing rate. But as both Franklin D. Roosevelt and Spider-Man said, this is just a gratuitous excuse to put a Spider-Man slide up, but apparently they both said, with great power comes great responsibility. And this is one reason why how we tell the story of our future is so important. Because if you can't imagine a better future, you can't make one. So we have plenty of biographers, right? They're called historians. But who is script writing the next episode? I mean, think about it. If I think about the story of our future that I've been hearing since I've been growing up, the discourse in our politics and its reflection in the media, let me sum it up for you. It goes something like this. The future is rubbish, especially if you vote for that guy. It's better in the old days. You've got to look after yourself. The world is violent and unsafe. The generation below you are feral and dangerous. Things are changing too fast. You can't trust scientists or New Agers or Democrats or Republicans or nerds or geeks or religious people or atheists or football fans or the rich or the poor or what you eat or your neighbor. You are alone. Make the best of it. Vote for me. Buy my paper. I understand. It's hardly inspiring, is it? And what's worse, it seems pretty constant. I can't remember a time in my life where I haven't heard that story. And I can feel its fingers reaching deep into my soul. And in this context, optimism seems like naivety. Well, I'm going to show you why it's not. As part of my trip, I visited this man. This is Mohammed Nasheed. He is the president of the Maldives. And he told me, thoughts are real. Once you've given thought to something, it can become material very quickly. And he should know. He's a former political prisoner, but now he's the first democratically elected president of his nation. He was imprisoned on 16 different occasions, spent a total of 6 years in jail, a lot of that in solitary confinement. The former dictatorial regime bound his hands and feet. They put laxatives and broken glass in his food, and they often placed him in a cell deliberately designed to heat up like an oven in the baking sunshine of the South Indian Ocean. And he told me the thing that saddened him the most about all this was he missed the birth of his 2 daughters. He was regularly beaten. He was tortured to the brink of death twice. And now he's the president. And he told me he was only able to achieve this by seeing a picture other than the very fearful picture that is staring you right in the face, with a belief that there is hope, that there is a bright future. And he's applying that same attitude to the climate change problem, because the Maldives is one of the lowest lying nations on the earth, and therefore they're naturally worried about sea level rise. He's in the process of turning his country carbon neutral, and he's already making some impressive inroads as an example to the rest of us. Now, I was lucky enough to attend an underwater cabinet meeting he held as part of the campaign to draw attention to his nation's plight. You may have seen this. It got huge international coverage. I mean, who isn't intrigued by a government meeting taking place underwater? And I'll guarantee it's the only time you'll see a meeting of people dressed in tight-fitting black rubber, and it's not something to do with the English aristocracy. So as I swam back to the shore, I ended up sort of swimming next to the president, and I must have looked surprised, because he gave me the hand signal for, "Are you okay?" And I responded with a hand signal for, "Yes, I'm okay," because there is no hand signal for, "Bloody hell, I'm at an underwater cabinet meeting in the Maldives, how cool is that?" But it's the sort of moment that makes you realize that anything is possible. And that's not a throwaway line. By the time I'd returned from my travels, I'd come to realize that our future, rather than being a damage limitation exercise could be a renaissance. Now, I'm not saying the future will be better, but I am saying there's everything to play for. So let's go through a few examples. So when we think about the future, we tend to think about it in personal terms, especially as you get older, you start to worry how long have you got and how healthy are those years going to be. So the good news is that nearly all of us are living longer and healthier. Can anybody here guess? Let's go back 100 years to 1911. Okay, can anybody here guess what the lowest national life expectancy was of any nation on Earth? Any guess? 25, not bad. You really are a pessimist. Most people guess around about 40, 45. It's actually 22. Anyone guess where that was? Don't reinforce my stereotypes about Americans. Africa is more than one nation. It was actually Bangladesh. Okay, so now I'm going to flip over to Gapminder here. You'll know this. You own it, I think. And we're going to, if you look at the life expectancy is the Y column. I'm just going to run this for 100 years. And slowly you can see those nations in Europe getting at the top there. And China really making a good old go of it. It's the 70s things really start happening. And there we are. These figures go up to 2009. Okay, where are Bangladesh now? They live till 67. Lowest life expectancy in the world anywhere today. Where do you think it is? Sorry? Zimbabwe? No, it's actually Afghanistan. Okay? Afghanistan, it's 44. It's a public health miracle worldwide. In the last 100 years, we've doubled the lowest life expectancy on the planet. And the lowest life expectancy is in Afghanistan. I mean, we know what Afghanistan's like, right? This is incredible. In fact, the gap between the rich and the poor when it comes to life expectancy is narrowing at an incredible rate. The Japanese now living to 83. And our advances in medicine and healthcare are not stopping. So, this lucky lady here being kissed by George Bush is Caitlin McNamara. She's not lucky because she's being kissed by George Bush. That would be a ridiculous thing to say. Although her father looks quite proud for some bizarre reason. But she's lucky because she's one of the few people in the world to have two bladders. The one she was born with, which was diseased, and the one she's got now, which was grown by taking a stem cell out of her existing bladder, growing a whole replacement of a bladder on a scaffold in a laboratory, and implanting it back into her. And she's not the only one. There's quite a few people wandering around the planet now with replacement body parts. In fact, the Wake Forest Institute of Regenerative Medicine in North Carolina is growing 22 types of human tissue in the laboratory as we speak. So is it possible that in my future, if I need a hip replacement, I'll grow my own? Well, actually, researchers at Columbia University Medical Center in New York have demonstrated just that technique in rabbits, using the animal's own stem cells to regrow joints. Thomas Einhorn at Boston Medical Center has helped more than 50 of his patients with degenerative hip disease by injecting their own stem cells into their hips and helping them grow new bone. And then, of course, there's the genomics revolution. So I went to see this man. This is George Church. And I didn't go to see him just because he has the best beard in science. Okay, now many of you will probably know this man. He's the man who, along with a few colleagues, kicked off the Human Genome Project. But it's what he's doing now that you really do need to pay attention to. It's a project, the Personal Genome Project, that could radically change medicine. So, over the coming years, what George and his team are going to do is sequence 100,000 volunteers' genomes and then try and correlate that data with their personal traits, their lifestyle, and their medical history to shed light on how our genetic code interacts with our environment, lifestyle, and when that's good for us and when that's bad for us. And the idea is you'll be able to avoid a good number of diseases by adapting your lifestyle, because now you'll know that for your genome, bananas, Tabasco, and tequila are a dangerous cocktail. To be honest, bananas, Tabasco, and tequila are always a dangerous cocktail. That's just a bit of personal advice. But close to home here, your own Sergey Brin is doing something similar. He's concentrating on Parkinson's disease and is profiling 10,000 Parkinson's sufferers. So beyond teasing out the relationship between our genes and our lifestyle, studies like this could give us access to this treasure trove of life-saving drugs that already exist but we can't use. So currently a lot of drugs get rejected because they fail, say, 1% of the population. And a drug with that kind of failure rate will never be approved. Of course it can't be. But you could use genome data to figure out that 1% and then give the drug to the 99% who could benefit. And the side effect of that is that drugs could get a lot cheaper. Because drug companies won't have to swallow the development cost of, on average, the 4,999 drugs that don't make it to market into the price of the one that does. Now, getting all those drugs and the other benefits of genomics requires cheap, mass market human genome sequencing. So we need to get to the point where all of us, if we want to, can share our genome with our doctor. So it's heartening, this is a logarithmic scale, it's heartening to see that the cost of genome sequencing isn't so much falling as plummeting. So the first complete human genome sequence, I'm sure many of you know, cost $100 million, and that was layered on top of $3 billion spent by the competing publicly funded effort. That was just 11 years ago, and there's a man in Harvard called David Weitz who reckons he might be able to do it for $30. So if sequencing costs carry on getting cheaper at this rate, you can even begin to sequence the genomes held in different individual cells and compare them. And that's already been done at a groundbreaking study at the Sanger Institute in Cambridge in the UK, where they took a genome from a healthy lung cell in one patient and they compared it to a cancerous lung cell. They sequenced the other genome. And that heralds a diagnosis that goes beyond, I'm sorry to tell you you've got cancer, to, you'll be pleased to know we've sequenced your cancer and we have a personalized set of treatments for you. And it's not just the biological sciences that are giving us this wealth of interesting medical options. This man is Robert Af Ekenstam, and he's the first recipient of Smart Hand, which is controlled by his thoughts, and it not only replicates the movement of the human equivalent that he lost to cancer, but it actually returns to Robin a sense of touch. I could go on, there's loads of the examples in the book, but medicine isn't abating. And if it continues like this, we can look forward to cheaper medicine that is preventative and interventions that could save or enhance your life in ways that would have been impossible to imagine just a few short years ago. I mean, this is basically the scene out at the end of The Empire Strikes Back where Luke Skywalker gets his hand back, which is pretty cool. Now, of course, faced with this trend of us all living longer and healthier, a lot of pessimists immediately and understandably start to worry about the population. I mean, isn't it the case that we're heading for some kind of carrying capacity crunch with too many mouths to feed? Well, despite the dramatic increase in human population since the 1950s, world food production per capita has increased. Now, that's a stunning achievement when you think how many more of us there are since 1950. There's more food per person now than there has ever been. Our crime is that we have not distributed it, or sometimes the means of production, equitably. Even still, according to the UN, there's a global food security situation that is, taken long term, improving. Now, the big worry, of course, is the effects of climate change will greatly reduce our ability to grow food as crops wither under the onslaught of rising temperatures. And that is a very real concern. But I'll be telling you a few ways we can, if we want, deal with the climate change threat in short order a little bit later. But even if we didn't have climate change to worry about, it is true that we just couldn't keep on adding production ad infinitum as the population continues to rise and rise and rise. I mean, we would run out of capacity at some point, no matter how good our technology. Well, the good news is that our population is in the process of stabilising. And the important figure to keep in mind here is 2.1. Now, that's the number of children that every woman has to have in order to keep the population static. And the 0.1 doesn't refer to the fact that some women have incredibly small babies, but is part of a statistic that accounts for the fact that some of us don't have children because they die before we get a chance or we're infertile. So let's just nip back to Gapminder now, and I'm going to go back 100 years. I'm going to take this back to 1911 again. And I want you to keep an eye on the other axis, which is the x-axis at the bottom, and that's the number of children per woman. So, again, not a huge amount, but you see Europe, of course, moving across. We're all having fewer children. 50s, Still not even, and then it gets to about 70, and then look, everybody starts racing across. It gets 2009, and look at the number of countries, including China, that are on the left, that 2.1 marker. Countries that aren't replacing their population include the United States, Canada, Russia, China, Australia, New Zealand, every country in Europe, Chile, Brazil, Sri Lanka, Thailand, North Korea, South Korea, Tunisia, Japan, Singapore, I could go on. If taken worldwide, the human race's fertility rate has fallen from 4.92 in the 50s to 2.56 at the beginning of this century. And by 2050, the UN's median variant estimate, that statisticians speak for best guess, is that the figure will dip below that all-important 2.1 replacement level across the entire population worldwide, which means we'll stabilise at about 9 billion people and then possibly fall in number. And what's interesting, I found out the other day that some economists are now worried about falling population because they link population growth to economic growth. Now, I disagree with them on that matter, but the fact that people are even worried now about a falling population is telling. But can we support 9 billion people? Can we increase our agricultural yields to deal with that number of us? Well, the good news is the answer is yes, and amazingly I found out we can combat climate change at the same time. So this device is gloriously named the Black Phantom, and I went to visit it in New Zealand. And what it does is make charcoal. Now, for those of you who don't know, a quick summary of why eco-geeks really love charcoal is it locks up carbon in a non-biodegradable form that you can bury, and therefore keeping that carbon out of the atmosphere. There's a scientist called Johannes Lehmann, I think I've got his name right there, who estimates that of these 60 gigatons of carbon that plants take out of the sky as they grow every year, 10% of that ends up as agricultural waste in farming and forestry. So that's corn stalks, rice stalks, branch, leaf litter, that kind of stuff. Enough that if you turned it into charcoal, you could halt the increase of atmospheric CO2 and actually reduce it by 0.7 gigatons a year, starting to reclaim the CO2 we've been pumping into the air. Well, that's very nice, isn't it? But how on earth do you convince farmers to turn all their waste biomass into charcoal? I mean, if you ever tried to convince a farmer of doing anything, it's pretty difficult. I know, I come from a rural area. Well, the good news is that certain types of charcoal added to the soil can radically improve your agricultural yields, actually as high as 50% in some cases. It's a natural and often very powerful fertilizer. But unfortunately, it's not as simple as that, because you can't just stick charcoal in the ground. Some types of charcoal can send your yields up, but others can send them down, which means you have to have a degree of control over the charcoal that you're making and the charcoal making process. And that's where this machine comes in, because it gives control. It gives farmers the ability to dial up exactly the right cooking program to deliver the charcoal that is tailored to their soils and therefore increase their yields. So now they've got a reason. In fact, they've got a very strong economic reason. You think about it, you buy one of these, you can increase your yields by 30%. In fact, Carbonscape, who make this machine, have now got their process down to such a fine art, to such a level of control, that they can make this stuff called activated carbon, which is an extremely porous form of carbon, has lots of uses. It can absorb pollutants, it's good for air purification, water filtration, even temporarily neutralise the effects of poison. But more impressively, you can use it in these, which is flatulence filtering underwear. That passes your farts through a activated carbon filter to neutralise the whiff. I can't understand how that woman was convinced to be in that advert. Really, it's incredible. I'm a Shreddies girl now. Thanks, Mum. So there you are, okay? That's a way to help feed our growing population. It combats climate change, it improves a lot of farmers, and it makes your boyfriend less offensive all at the same time. So even if you don't accept the climate change argument, and if you don't, you're clearly an idiot, this is still undeniably a good thing for the economy. So let's keep with this farming theme. So I'm in the Australian outback, and I'm driving along with these two geezers called Tony and Bruce. And Tony stops the car, and we go out and we look at this paddock here, on the right. So as you can see, it's almost totally bereft of vegetation. Now, as you know from the news recently, Australia has this rather distressing cycle of drought and flood. And when I visited, the drought had been 9 years long. So naturally, I said to Tony, looking at that paddock, Well, is that from the lack of rain? And he said, look down the fence. And we're standing up to our knees on the other side of the fence in grass. And then everywhere in the Australian outback, I saw this everywhere I went. It was barren soils inside the paddock, grass out on the other side of the fence. I mean, miles and miles and miles of it. So Tony bends down, and he grabs up some of that grass, and it comes away in his hand. He says, this is dying, though. And that's the other half of the problem. And it was in understanding what was happening down the line of that fence that I discovered something pretty awe-inspiring. Now, I know I'm in Silicon Valley, and this is Google, but I am going to talk about some technology that is distinctly low-tech. So I hope you'll bear with me, because what happens here is potentially astounding. To understand it, you have to go back in time when our grasslands were dominated by large herds of grazing animals, so bison here in America or wildebeest in Africa. So the Serengeti is one of the few remaining natural grasslands on the planet with these huge migrating herds of zebra and wildebeest. And there's no beginning or end to their journey. They have this constant clockwise trek. It's about 1,800 miles as they search for fresh water and fresh grass. And the herds stay closely packed together to defend themselves against predators. And what happens is a herd comes along, it eats some grass, and then it moves on looking for some fresh stuff. And in the Serengeti, that herd won't be back on the same piece of land for over a year. Now that's important because there's a natural relationship between grasses and grazing animals. You see, the growing buds of a grass plant are at the base, and they need sunlight. And if the plant gets too tall, it starts to kill itself in its own shade because it can't photosynthesize. And that's why the grass had come away in Tony's hand. Now in nature, the herd would have come along, eaten the tops off the plant, exposing those growth buds, and then moved on. Now the problem with the way we farm livestock today is we don't let them roam. So we split up these big herds, and we put them into separate paddocks, and we keep them there for way too long, and they've got no predators, so they can wander where they like in that space, which means the grass never gets a chance to grow, because the animal will just have a go at it as soon as it starts sprouting. And to understand why that's important, you need to know that grass plants are roughly the same amount of matter above ground and below ground. They're in balance. And if an animal eats some grass off the top, within minutes, the same amount, or roughly the same amount of root matter will sort of slough off into the soil. And that will enrich the soil with carbon. Now, while nearly all of that carbon will be lost back to the atmosphere as the root matter rots, it does leave behind a small amount of residue. And, as Tony told me, a little bit of a bloody big amount soon adds up. Because there are 3.5 billion hectares of agricultural grasslands on our planet. And if you increase the organic carbon content of those soils by just 1%, which is easy to do, that would offset 12 years of global CO2 emissions. 1% is nothing. There's much higher percentages in where they've been testing this. Also, any farmer can adopt this system, okay? And doing their business a huge favour in the process. The technology they're using? Fences, okay? What you do is you build lots of small paddocks. And then you form your cattle into one big herd, and you put them in each paddock for a day or two. And that way you're mimicking the way they would have moved on a natural grassland like the Serengeti. It's the Serengeti, but on a farm, essentially. And the result is this. So the farmer clearly in the middle is the one that's using this technique. And the benefits, regardless of what you think about climate change, the benefits are financially enormous. Your cost of production goes down. You don't need to buy feed. You don't need to buy any fertilizer. I met one farmer using this method whose cost for a kilo of beef was a quarter of the Australian national average. He can sell his meat at a huge profit, more, for cheaper than his neighbours can manufacture it. And it's all organic too. I met one farmer. He'd bought a failing farm, sold most of the farm equipment, bought a bunch of fences and 2 motorbikes. And his neighbours thought he was bonkers. And now he rides out to a paddock once a day on his lovely shiny new motorbike, opens up a gate, lets a large herd of cattle walk through, then goes home. He said, my neighbours wonder what I do all day. But the good news is these soils become rich in carbon, so they start to retain more water. So a 1% increase in organic matter relates to an extra 150 tons of water storage per hectare. Now, for a nation in the grip of drought, that's a big deal. And when the rains come, well, they don't run off the top of that dry, compact surface, causing those devastating floods, but instead the water soaks into that carbon-rich soil. And who do you think is showing the first institutional signs of investing in this fabulous new technology of the fence? Pension funds. Pension funds, because they want assets that grow slowly in value over time, and that's what this is. So again, it's good for the planet, it's good for farmers, deals with drought and flood, feeds our growing population, it's even good for your pension. And all it takes is a few fences. And what I really like about that is it reminds us that even as we develop these fantastic new technologies and geek ourselves up to heaven, sometimes all you have to do is think a bit clearer about a problem to solve some of our grand challenges. In fact, Australia has a wealth of people solving really big problems. This is the Stubby glove. It's a glove made of neoprene rubber that has an inbuilt bottle holder. The logic being that if you fall over, you don't drop your beer. So only in Australia is falling over more of a problem if you've lost your beer and not your balance. I was in a motel reception, I first saw this, and I just blew my mind. You know, I've seen lots of interesting things. I've discovered got nanotechnology, synthetic biology, the whole lot. The Stubby glove was the thing that confused me the most. I went up to the reception, I said, "Is that for real?" And she completely ignored me and turned to my friend Tony and said, "What's his problem?" And he said, "He's English." And she went, "Ah." Apparently that explained everything. Actually, if you're in Australia and you're English, you're basically insulted for being English, and then your sexuality is questioned. It's like hello over there. So I'm going to go to one final piece of sort of climate change bashing tech. I'm going to go to this man. This is Klaus Lackner. Now, Klaus has built a machine that strips carbon dioxide out of the air, and it's full of this stuff. You probably can't see it from over there, but this is a sorbent that absorbs carbon dioxide. Now, Klaus's machines, on one side, they have air with the level of CO2 we've got in it now, and on the other side of his machine is air with CO2 levels less than there was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So this material here, it absorbs CO2, and then when you get it wet, it gives it back. And then it bubbles up to the top of Klaus's machine like bubbles in champagne, and you can collect it. Now, Klaus needs $20 million. Just $20 million to turn his lab prototype into a licensable, manufacturable unit that can take a ton of CO2 from the air per day. And 100 million of them would solve the climate change problem like that. Now, that sounds a lot until you realize we make 73 million cars every year. So why not nip down to this web address and give them $1 or $2? Your government decided not to. But what to do with all that CO2? Well, here's one idea, and it takes us back to George Church with a fantastic beard and all that biotech. Because there are several companies now fiddling with the genomes of bacteria to make them create fuels. And one of them I spoke to is a company called Dual Biotech, has an organism that eats CO2 and produces liquid fuels. It excretes kerosene, ethanol, gasoline. So if you couple Klaus Lackner's CO2 capture technology with a Joule system, or one of their competitors, there's many companies trying to do this, we could literally pull our fuels out of the sky. Now, of course, burning those fuels will put the carbon back in the atmosphere, but crucially, the system isn't adding any carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. You know, it's what eco-geeks call carbon neutral. I mean, think about it. It's a carbon neutral petrol station that pulls fuels out of the sky. Now, it's going to take a few technology generations to make that economically viable, but even ExxonMobil gave Craig Ventnor, who has a similar plan on his drawing board, $600 million to look at the idea. Now, because my time is short, I'm afraid I can't tell you about all the things I saw. I don't have time to tell you about this. Okay, this is a organic solar panel made from carbon, flexible, runs off a printer in New Bedford. similar technologies like that are heralding an off-grid green power revolution. I don't have time to tell you about Leo here. He's a sociable robot, and he's part of research that means that our relationship with technology could become a lot more like friendship. I can't tell you about the starfish. This robot is arguably self-aware, and the brain that was in that robot was taken out and is now discovering scientific truths and explaining them to its creator, and by some measures is outperforming Isaac Newton. And regrettably too, I can't have time to tell you about the revolution in nanotechnology that is already influencing manufacture and will continue to do so, promising higher and higher performance at cheaper and cheaper costs as we learn to control matter at finer and finer levels of granularity. It's already taken the spectre of the water war off the table by enabling us to create membranes that radically reduce the cost of desalination. This picture here is another nano miracle. It's a tea bag that contains carbon and some nanofibers, and it will turn a river full of pathogens into a drinkable fresh water source, and it does it for pennies. So, what does it all mean, all this rapid innovation? And how do we make sense of it? Well, I think the most important thing that anyone said to me on my trip came from the mouth of a philosopher and an ethicist who has a deep interest in the biotech revolution. He's called Mark Stevenson, and he edits a magazine called Artificial Life out of MIT. And he said this: change will happen, and you can try to influence it in a constructive way, or you can try to stop it from happening, or you can ignore it. Well, trying to stop it from happening, I think, is futile, and ignoring it, he said, seems irresponsible. You see, you can try and stop the advance of knowledge in some places, if you're brutally draconian or conservative, but not for very long, of course. Lost knowledge is soon rediscovered, and the more technology, like you're developing, allows increasing autonomy of the individual, the harder it becomes to suppress our advances, whether they're good or bad. So hoping to roll back the march of human culture is about as pointless as trying to reconstruct the frog that your younger brother has just put in the blender. The frog is dead. Deal with it. Attempting, as some people are, to hold on to something essentially human by trying to fight against the very thing that humans do best, which is evolved through culture and technology, is ultimately futile. This is who we are. We innovate, we invent, and we do it faster and faster as time goes on, as one invention gives us a platform to create something more powerful next time around. I mean, I don't have to tell you guys that, you're Google, for God's sake. But here's a question: can our morals keep up? I mean, Einstein famously said, it has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity. Well, I think our morals can, but they're not going to do it using the systems we've got now. So it became strikingly clear to me that the rate of change that's embedded in the pace of innovation, like places at Google, and many of the other disciplines I looked at, and the rate of change that governs the pace of change in our government and our big institutions are radically different. They cannot legislate for this stuff. And that's very problematic, because a lot of this stuff is dangerous. It's not because the people in governments are bad or lazy, although some of them are, clearly. It's because they operate in this hierarchy that's simply architected to move very slowly. So as I came to the end of my journey, I began to realize there was a big problem with innovation. Because when we talk about innovation, and you know this, it's easy. We reference technology, we reference medicine, or we might even talk about innovation in music or dance or fashion. But we hardly ever talk about institutional innovation, changing the way our corporations or our governments actually work. And our governments talk about stimulating innovation, but they don't do anything to change their operating principles. I go back to the last innovation in parliamentary democracy was 1928, and that was giving women the vote. I mean, when we invented it in the 1700s, it was a massive institutional innovation. Well done, bravo. It's 300 years have gone past, fellas. You know, now I get to vote once every 4 years for two people I disagree with to take over an archaic system that can't keep up with the pace of change. To quote Einstein again, you cannot solve the problems you've got with the same level of thinking you're at when you created them. Vicky Buck, who's one of the creators of the Black Phantom that I showed you earlier, she's the ex-mayor of Christchurch, That's an office she held as an independent politician, I think, for 8 or 9 years. And she quit government despite this huge ongoing majority, so she could develop new schools and green tech companies. Because she believes, and I agree with her, and this is a direct quote, "If we wait for our governments to solve the climate change problem, we're all fucked." And yet we've grown up in a world where we wait for permission, where power and influence seems to rest at the top of hierarchies and trickles down. Except, and you know this, that's now changing. So the people I met on my journey were just getting on with solving our problems, building their own legislative frameworks, because they are realizing that we as a network society have to. As the tools available to us become both cheaper and more powerful, we can build even more incredible things without overbearing capital or government funding. You know, the average cost of a high-tech startup in Singapore is now $50,000. And because of people like you, we're becoming more interconnected. So that means you can now find the people and resources you need much more cheaply. So in this coming world, you're going to lead not by getting promoted, but by getting connected. And looked at one way, this rapid innovation in this changing world is slightly terrifying. And part of my personal reboot I had to go through was realizing I had to find a way of dealing with change as the norm and not the exception, and realizing that society, having enjoyed a period of relative stability since the Industrial Revolution, is, in my lifetime, going to see a radical shift. I need to learn to let go of ideas on a regular basis, and so do you. That's scary, but the way I came to get around it in my head was to think of it a bit like a relationship. I mean, have you ever agonized about breaking up with someone? You know. But if it's the right thing to do, you'll feel sad about the trauma, but somehow a new window of opportunity has opened up in your soul, and you'll take what you learned from that last disastrous relationship, and you'll take those lessons and make the next one better, and you know it. And I think that's how I feel about the industrial capitalist society that I've grown up in. I'm scared to break up with it. We've been together so long. But break up we must, so we can start going steady with the information age. I concluded, therefore, that I have to approach the future by judging my worth not by what I own, but by what I create and share and that other people can build on. If you look at our intertwining revolutions of nanotechnology, biotechnology, and infotechnology, you're seeing this incredible acceleration of capacity at lower and lower cost. It's a world where you'll be valued not by how much you own, but by how much you innovate. Another thing I realized was it's called the information age for a reason. If you don't know how to sift fact from opinion, you're in trouble. As an individual, as a company, as a nation. In an age where we are now overwhelmed with information, the old model of having it filtered for us by newspapers or politicians or broadcasters or publishers or authors is falling apart. In fact, as the world becomes more information rich, we begin to see just how poor a job those trusted filters have been doing for us. And what that means is, and I'm glad about this, is a questing disposition, research skills, the desire to ask a meaningful question are going to come back in vogue. Being smart is going to become the ultimate fashion accessory. Which means we need to teach our kids and ourselves critical thinking, creative research skills. And our schools do not do this. And even when they try, our industrial capitalist educational system stifles it. So in the UK, I found out we have an A-level now in critical thinking. I was very excited to find out about this. And then I found out that some universities have an official policy of discounting the value of it when they think about admissions, and that includes Cambridge and University College London. So we're already seeing this almighty clash between the hierarchical power structures that we're used to being wrong-footed by these fast-moving networkers. And the next generation of influencers, of which some are in this room, I'm sure, really have no patience with what they see as an archaic and quaint institution that talks of promoting innovation but doesn't innovate itself. Because the world is Darwinian in the end, even for governments. If you do not adapt, you die. Which all sounds very depressing. But as Dwight Eisenhower said, I like to believe that people in the long run are going to do more to promote peace than governments. Indeed, I think people want peace so much that one of these days governments had better get out of the way and let them have it. And perhaps we're moving closer to that moment. In fact, another thing I cover in the book, and I discussed with your own Vince Cerf, is the staggering decline in violence worldwide and terrorism. The world is in fact getting more peaceful, and yet we think it's more violent. And why is that? Because violence is now the exception that we draw attention to, rather than the cultural norm it was just a few centuries ago, that we embraced and we thought was a fine way of doing business. So as our tools become more powerful and the nature of influence becomes more networked, it is crucial that we start to put a different narrative of our future back on the table. And I believe that as a network we have a far better chance of our future being a renaissance rather than a damage limitation exercise that the old guard is selling us. It's not going to be easy, but if you can't imagine that better future, you cannot make it happen. There's a man called Henry G. He's one of the senior editors at Nature, and he wrote a brilliant review of my book, and not just because it was very nice about it, but because I think in a few short words he nailed it. He said, "The future is here and all around us. It's just, as William Gibson puts it, not evenly distributed yet." And why not? Because we have 21st century tech, but our familiar world, from our schools to work to our ideas about retirement, hasn't changed since the Industrial Revolution. And the future cannot happen until we raise our minds to meet it. And what I'm saying is, we can no longer make do with these tired but fated attitudes of cynicism, lazy opinion, and fatalism. Our tools are becoming too powerful for us to wield them with anything other than critical thinking and a story of renewal. Because as that would-be astronaut at Mojave told me, I like this planet, it's where all my stuff is. And I think we should manage it better because we're in charge of it. Not our governments, but you and me. It's one reason I'm now involved in a project called the Age of Smart, which is a think tank and an action tank for the planet, which we're trialling with an addressable audience of 30 million of the world's poorest people in Africa and Asia. I couldn't have even thought about trying that a few years ago, but now I can. So we need to adopt a new mantra about our future and then commit ourselves, every one of us, to it. And it's simply this: cheer up. It might happen. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Thanks for your talk. It was wonderful. My question is around kind of the educational institutions that you briefly just mentioned at the end there, and kind of this transition from the Industrial Revolution institutions, which I think education is still kind of locked into, and information-oriented educational institutions, which we don't know really what it looks like yet.
Yeah.
What do you think it looks like? I mean, a lot of the problem I see around is kind of accreditation versus education, because you really don't need to go to school anymore to get educated. I mean, the internet offers so much resources, but there's an issue of accreditation and, what do you actually know and how does one kind of present that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I don't have all the answers, but I do think that this whole idea that you gain an inventory of skills that at some point will be useful to you is pointless. I mean, think about it. Kids that are going to school now will retire when, if we keep the same retirement age, 2075, something like that? I mean, God, you look at Google, none of you even know what the world's going to look like in 5 years' time, and yet we're supposed to be educating our kids for the rest of their lives. So the only thing I think we can do is do what I said in the talk, which is make schools or educational institutions, whatever they look like, places where you learn critical thinking skills, scientific methods, Socratic inquiry, logic, the ability to debate, the ability to work out what your own prejudices are. Because you can get information now. I mean, thanks to Google, we can pretty much get the answers out of the sky. What we can't do is work out if those answers are good or bad or who's telling them to us. So the only skill you've really got to learn in the information age is how to handle information and think about it critically. And, part of me, I'm thinking about having kids now, and part of me is thinking I'm going to have to educate them at home because I cannot trust the local school to teach them what's really important. Ken Robinson is probably the man to go and ask that question of. He is a brilliant thinker in this area. So I don't have the answer, but, I have the answer in broad brushstrokes, so I don't have the answer in fine detail. But a lot of teachers are stuck in these silos where they, do continuing professional development that is about getting some ticks on their CV and not about learning how to teach kids better. Sorry, that sounds depressing. I'm supposed to be an optimist. Any other questions? Or have I stunned you into silence? You're all smiling, which means you either think I'm crazy. Oh, here's another one.
So I'll ask a question. You have that great picture of a fence that has, green on one side and death on the other side.
Yeah.
And so there are farmers obviously right next to the green farmer who are not picking up the idea.
Yeah,
What do we do to get that to happen?
This is incredible. I asked that question. I'm sitting there, I'm going, does the farmer over the other side of the fence not get this? And Tony said to me, well, mate, these are special Australian fences. They're impervious to ideas. And that's the point I make towards the end. You've got to learn to let go of ideas on a regular basis. We're used to thinking that things stay the same. And they don't. And they can't. And if they do, we're in trouble. So, again, I think it comes down to education. There's a generation there that probably won't get it, but let's hope their kids do. Is that it? Just 2 questions about the entire future? I guess you guys probably know it more than I do. I think you're probably, oh yeah. Here's one.
Good day. I'm curious if in your tour of the world, and I've only just bought the book, I've not read it yet, but
Okay.
If peak oil is a subject that you've considered or looked at, written about.
I don't look at it specifically because peak oil is one of those things that people argue about. Some people say it's happened, some people say it isn't happening. I don't think we should ever count on oil running out or oil companies not finding a way to go and exploit new resources. The Arctic melts, they go, great, we can get under it quicker. The only way we'll deal with that problem is by making the other alternatives cheaper, which is why I think the synthetic biology biofuels are so important. That's why some of those oil companies are giving people like Craig Mentor $600 million. Because think of it, if you're BP, just a PR disaster, it's actually much better for you to make your business by getting bacteria to make your oil than, the disaster we've just had. So I think relying on peak oil as the economic driver is the wrong thing. You need to carry on innovating so that the alternatives you've got. I mean, this stuff, this is organic carbon. It comes off a printer, and the efficiencies of this are going up and up and up. And you're getting to grid parity in a few countries now. Some people say it's just happened in Japan, which means that the Japanese solar power industry is now growing at 109% a year. It doesn't have to do that for many years before we think, we're making a decision based on economics, not on the economy.
So you said our government needs to change. Did you have any thoughts on that?
I was actually speaking at the US Treasury Executive Institute recently, and I sat there in front of people from the IRS and Homeland Security and various other people and told them this, that they needed to change. And they all nodded sagely and looked rather depressed and said, yes, we do. But you kind of got that feeling that they didn't think they could because of the way their organisation works. And in fact, very nicely, one lady from Homeland Security came up to me afterwards and asked me for a job. I don't think... this is a controversial view, and I don't know whether I've fully committed to this yet, but I've pretty much given up on government to solve our problems. Not because the people in government are bad or evil, because the architecture is just too slow. I've often said to people, when people have asked me a similar question, if you wanted to get a good look on where the US economy was going, would you go and talk to the current administration? You had one choice. You've got to go talk to 1 or 2 people. Would you go and talk to the US administration, or would you go and talk to the board of Google? And everybody says, I'll go and talk to the board of Google. Why? Because Google understands networks. What we need to do, and what Google, I hope, is going to get involved with, and what I'm doing with this Age of Smart project, is networked governance. Our power system is going to stop looking like a hierarchy and start looking a bit more like the internet as we get more off-grid stuff happening, and feed-ins and all that kind of stuff. Our government should start to look the same. And if I could ask Google to be involved in one thing, networked governance. How do we manage ourselves? How do we make our government look more like TCP/IP?
Well, your last comments there might indicate that this line of questioning doesn't bear fruit, but I'm wondering if in your travels you encountered some instances of futuristic-oriented scientists who were serving in government and who had, and in some ways were functioning positively in creating new policy and changing the shape of government. What you said about the Maldives was interesting in some ways, but you logged a lot of miles, and I'm wondering what you saw.
Actually, it's a really good question. I mean, I hadn't thought about it, but now I think about it, I think all the people that I met that I thought were the most innovative and the people I wanted to go and see, pretty much none of them were working in government-funded areas. I mean, Harvard Medical School gets money from the government, clearly. But most of them are kind of, they were just getting on with it. And in fact, a lot of them were saying, I'm doing, I mean, so for instance, I was in Palo Alto, I talked to a man called John Seeley Brown. Actually, Vince Cerf says you have to go and see this guy. And John told me this story about some people he's working with, 10 guys in a garage, who are building, from a quantum mechanical perspective, an alternative to platinum. And they're designing it from the bottom up. And he says they're pulling the computing power off the cloud to be able to do this because the computing power required to design it is massive. He says 5 years ago you would have had to go to a national lab, ask for a budget of $100 million and put aside a few years, and you'd probably have tried a combinatorial design process rather than designing it from the bottom up. And now he says I've got 10 guys in a garage doing it in Palo Alto. You don't need government funding anymore. And I think the smart scientists are going, you know what, why would I go through all that? I want to get on. I mean, I was talking to Dan Rico while I was here, your head of environmental projects, if I've got his title right, and he said, he was talking to one of you guys at a product launch, and he said, so how do you launch the product? And one of you said, well, you press that button there. And he went, what? When you press, he said, you just press the button. He said, yeah, press the button and it goes out and we see if it works. And he said, I come from the energy industry. Let me tell you about how we deploy a product. And it took forever. So, we're getting to that stage, and that's why we need to have networked governance, because when you have the ability to deploy incredible power very quickly from one place, we better start thinking about legislating differently. And complaining that government isn't doing it, is like complaining that a fish isn't winning the 100 meters. It's the wrong thing for the job, and you're the right thing for the job.
Mark, thank you for coming here. You said that the school system is failing on our kids. So beyond just your book here, which is obviously very good, is there any other material that you would recommend for like the generations of, middle school kids who you think they could benefit from? A website or other books? Or
I would say that I would direct you to Ken Robinson's site. I think it's kenrobinson.com. And he's got a lot of links there, but he talks about how to keep part of your creativity and how schools kind of crush creativity. I think the thing is when you look at kids, is we don't start off not being creative. I don't know a 4-year-old that isn't a natural scientist and a natural artist to an astonishing degree. But by the time we get out of school, we've stigmatized mistakes. The whole idea of putting your hand up in class, when do you put the hand up? When you know the answer. You should put your hand up when you don't know the answer, for God's sake. We've stigmatized mistakes. Here's one thing that I think every parent can do, and it's from Isidore Rabi. He's a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. He was asked by the New York Times, why did you become a scientist when lots of kids of your generation grew up to, he was a Jewish immigrant, lots of Jewish immigrants of your generation grew up to go into the professions. They became doctors, they became architects, they became teachers. Why did you become a scientist? And he said, my mother made me a scientist without realizing it. Because most kids would come home and their parents would say, what did you learn today? And I would come home and my mum would say, did you ask a good question today? Ask your kids every day, did you ask a good question today? And that's one thing. Because they'll really start pissing off their teachers pretty quickly then. For all the right reasons.
Thank you. Good talk. The question I had was around New Barofean's Jewel, you mentioned briefly.
Sorry, I can't quite hear you.
New Barofean's Jewel, you mentioned that briefly.
Oh, the Jewel biotech company.
Yes, Jewel. And I was wondering, having looked at it, what would you put the chance of success of that over the next 5, 10, 15 years?
I think what you can't do is look at the success of a particular company, but you can look at the success of a particular industry. So if you go back to the automotive industry, when it kicked off, there were hundreds of firms, and then there were like tens of firms, and now we've got a few firms. There are literally, I think I can think off the top of my head now, probably about 10 or 12 firms that are rushing to commercialise this bacterially produced biofuels. Jewel Biotech is one, LS9 is another. Some are using algae. And I say in the book, they might fail, but not all of them will. One of them will get it right. So, and I would think, I would like to think that by the time my kids are driving, they're driving with fuel that is come from a bacteria, not out of the ground. Thank you.
Hi. In your travels, do you talk to lots of people, and did you notice any similarities between cultures that were more innovative, or why certain people you thought had the background to become more innovative, or any?
I think that's a great question. And towards the end of the book, lots of people ask me, what was the most amazing thing you saw? What was the most inspiring thing you saw? And I came to the conclusion that one common thread amongst everybody I met, and I went all around the world. I ended up, as I say, at an underwater cabinet meeting and then at Harvard Medical School. It was a pretty eclectic tour. But I concluded that every single one of the people I met was guided by one guiding principle. And that was, how can I make the world better? And they all seemed pretty happy. And that was across all the cultures I met. Mohammed Nasheed is a leader of a deeply Islamic nation. George Church is a bearded guy in Harvard. I met those farmers in Australia as well. They really believed, even when they were insulting me and questioning my sexuality, that the world could be better just by changing the way you use fences. And all of them, again, same thing. They all asked questions: how can I do this better, and how can I make the world better? That's the only thing I can think that is the overall guiding principle. I think that's it, haven't I? Any more? There we go. Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.